So today I'm going to do the last part of movement and just talk about the basal ganglia. That's going to take a little bit of time, and then I'm going to chop this up a little bit differently than usual and have the next PowerPoint be the movement disorders. And there are a couple of videos to watch in the middle of those, so however you want to do those, all of the links will be down there in Blackboard. And this one too, I have a suggested video that you don't have to watch, but if you are interested in really understanding how the basal ganglia work, I'm going to keep it really simple, and that goes into a little bit more of the complications of what's going on with those brain structures. Okay, I'm going to talk about the basal ganglia a number of times here in trying to explain and expose you to the complications of the basal ganglia. This is a large group of subcortical structures in the forebrain that are involved in movements, as we'll see really the initiation of movements where we are internally guiding these movements. Okay, and people include in the basal ganglia at least the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. But usually, oftentimes, they also talk about the substantia nigra, which are these dopamine-producing cells that provide input into these structures. I talk about it as somewhat separated, but some people include it as part of the basal ganglia, as I think of it as the sort of beginning of the chain. And many people also include a subthalamic nucleus. So I have that discussion, or I have the picture there of the thalamus as being part of this. The subthalamic nucleus is the underneath the thalamus kind of nucleus, and then we have the midbrain areas of that is referring to two regions of the substantia nigra. So what I am including here is the direct pathway, and I do this again at the beginning of talking about movement disorders because understanding the basal ganglia is really important for understanding what's happening with these movement disorders. So when I decide to make a movement, my cerebral cortex is active and it is communicating to the striatum. Okay, and the caudate nucleus and the putamen, those two structures, they are often referred to as the striatum. Okay, so that's the striatum. And then the caudate nucleus and putamen, they are sending inhibitory messages to the globus pallidus. And the globus pallidus is sending inhibitory messages to the thalamus and to one of the areas of the substantia nigra. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning of noticing the complication of what I'm doing. Okay, and the thalamus is sending excitatory information to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex. So what I'm doing when I decide to make a movement and I'm exciting that striatum is I am inhibiting an inhibitor. So normally what we're doing is inhibiting the thalamus from having this activity where the thalamus likes to chat and it likes to talk to the motor cortex. So we would be moving a lot all the time if we didn't have the globus pallidus inhibiting this thalamic kind of communication. Okay, and so when we consciously decide to go make a movement, we are going to inhibit the globus pallidus so that the thalamus can communicate to the motor cortex. Okay, so that's the beginning of the sort of complications of the basal ganglia. I go through that again. That is really talking about the direct pathway, whereas the indirect pathway, there is an indirect pathway as well, but then I feel like I have to explain the two different areas of the substantia nigra, and it gets complicated because the indirect route is really involved in inhibiting the cerebral cortex so that we're not, again, making movements that we don't want to make. And these two routes are working together, again, so that we're not making movements we don't want to make, and when we consciously decide to make a movement, we can make that movement. So I'm saying a lot of that here now with the slide that has words instead of pictures. There's a lot of spontaneous activity in the globus pallidus. I actually didn't say that. So it is inhibiting that subthalamic nucleus, the thalamus. The caudate nucleus and the putamen are basically telling the globus pallidus which movements to stop inhibiting. It's inhibition of. And the basal ganglia, basically, we are selecting a movement by ceasing to inhibit it. That's the kind of overall view of what I just explained with the picture. Your author goes through a number of studies that are showing how the basal ganglia, what role they're really playing in this self-initiated kind of movement. And I'm just including two of these. One is the Turner and Anderson in 2005 examining monkeys where, let me see if I get this right, a light came on, and between 1.5 seconds and 3 seconds, the monkey had to move its hand, and it had to get to the spot where the hand needed to move to in order to receive food. The monkey could not start before 1.5 seconds, or he or she did not get the food, and they couldn't finish after the 3 seconds, or he or she wouldn't get the food. So this is deciding on the timing of that hand movement, and that is showing activity in the basal ganglia for that really self-initiated kind of movement. And here are some people whose names I'm not going to say correctly, I'm pretty sure. Wepner and Weiler in 1998. They used PET imaging to look at people's brain activity as they were drawing lines on a screen with a computer mouse. And if the person was drawing a new line on the, or sorry, circle, they were drawing circles, that should say circles, on the screen with a computer mouse. If they started a new circle, we see activity in the basal ganglia. If they went and traced over a circle that was already on the screen, there was not so much activity in the basal ganglia, showing that the basal ganglia are critical for initiating an action, but not when an action is really directly guided by a stimulus that's out in the world. And I know I am repeating this, and some of this was before the exam that we talked about many different areas of the cortex that are involved with making movements and what their roles were in when we are making movements. We talked about the cerebellum and its role in not just making movements, but it's a lot about the timing, the precise timing of sequences of movements and exact movements, but also the timing of other things. And now I've also just gone through the basal ganglia. So for now, you really just want to focus on the basal ganglia, but just remember those are the brain mechanisms overall that we have discussed.